Hi, and welcome to my channel Ongeduld. And this time we will discuss The Incoherence of Philosophers by Al-Ghazali, or as he is translated to Dutch, Verlost van onzin. In front of me I have the Dutch translation, but the English translation, Incoherence of Philosophers, is easily found as a PDF online, and also I think there are some translations on Amazon. So if you're curious, look it up. I can recommend it at least, but feel free to stay and watch the whole video about the content of the book. So let's start with Al-Ghazali, who he is. And I was quite lucky, to be honest, to have a translation which had a very broad introduction, but also explanatory notes on his work, who Al-Ghazali was, why he is quite controversial, or at least why some people interpreted him as being a quite controversial thinker, and also further remarks on how to interpret his texts and his philosophical insights and his standpoints, because he was quite controversial. So let's first start with a general overview of who he was. Al-Ghazali was an Islamic thinker. If I remember correctly, he was living in the 10th century in Baghdad, which was a Islamic empire, and also a center of knowledge, which wasn't necessarily lost with the fall of the Roman Empire, but Baghdad really had a very important role in revitalizing all the lost philosophical works of Plato, of Aristotle, and in general it was a popular hub of scientific and philosophical thinking. And in this city, Al-Ghazali taught quite some different courses. He was a philosopher. He was also a very Islamic thinker, and I forgot the translation to what he exactly did. But he was focused on laws, and especially on Islamic laws. So he interpreted the Islamic laws within Baghdad. And what he noticed is that a lot of people, they were leaving the Islamic faith, or at least they seemed more or less to adhere to the Islamic faith, but not to fully convinced of the Islamic faith. They, for example, written in the introduction, it is notified that a lot of people were more or less saying that they were Islamic, but not keeping to the rules. So they were still drinking, and they were still being very gluttonous, etc. So Al-Ghazali noticed this and was quite critical of it, and also of the, in general, philosophical sciences. So here it becomes quite a bit controversial again, because he was quite critical of some parts of the philosophical sciences, because sometimes they sort of overstep their boundaries, and they try to explain things which were not compatible with the Islamic religion. And there he decided he should step up and defend this, his religion, and also the fact that the sciences should be, they should stay within their boundaries of knowledge. And he wrote a whole book about this. So he was very he wrote a whole book about the certain sort of topics where science overstepped their boundaries, and where he think they should take a step back. And this ended with 3 points. So 3 points where Ghazali stated that the sciences really overstepped their boundaries and were in stark contrast with the Islamic faith. And there he implied that for those people who still then focused on these 3 topics, a fatwa should, start, which is sort of a criminal warrant that these people were enemies of the Islamic faith. And a lot of modern thinkers, so for example the new atheist, but also quite right-leaning thinkers, but not even on the far right, but also within the philosophical domain. So, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson, they looked at Al-Ghazali's work and saw with his statements and with his fatwa that with Al-Ghazali, the sort of the progress of science stopped, and sort of the enlightenment of the Islamic faith was cut down by his statements. And the translators of this book really tried to nuance this position and show that Al-Ghazali was still in favor of science, was still in favor of mathematics, was still in favor of philosophy, and indeed of the general sciences, but was against the overstepping of science, its boundaries, sort of, and that he isn't the controversial figure that people try to make him out to be. So, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson gave a presentation on science, and connected, for example, 9/11 to the works of Al-Ghazali. The same goes for the recently attacked Salman Rushdie, who also wrote a whole novel in which the two philosophers, so Al-Ghazali and another Islamic philosopher, battled it out, and where Al-Ghazali really was the sort of the conservative, anti-scientific thinker. And in the introductions and in this book, it's really made clear that Al-Ghazali isn't the unscientific thinker. And that's also why I think it's important for people to read this book, because not only in the introduction, but also in general, Al-Ghazali multiple times refers to the scientific world as quite important and as useful tools to expand your knowledge and expand our knowledge of God's given world, sort of, and how science isn't at all wrong, but should stay within these limits. And also, he makes the arguments that science should stay within these boundaries via, for example, logical reasoning, which is very interesting, because at a certain point, Al-Ghazali, for example, states that a lot of the scientific thinkers focused on Aristotle's logic. And what he shows also is that within Aristotle's logic, there's a sort of a fault, at least he sees it as a fault. That is that a lot of these scientific thinkers made the assumption that, for example, causality is a real thing. And you see this also with Hume, for example, and there are also quite a lot of links between Al-Ghazali and Descartes, where he tries to doubt everything. And also, so he also tries to doubt causality, which he states which he sees as sort of a position that we take for granted. So, for example, every time I lit a fire and keep it to paper, yes, it will burn. But then again, I cannot prove that there is causality. I don't see causality, and there may be a time where the paper does not burn if I keep it close to the flames. And that's the point that Al-Ghazali tries to make, is that a lot of the scientific reasoning is based on certain, and he calls it taqlid, or to spell it out, T-A-Q-L-I-D, which is sort of a dogmatic, or, well, dogmatic is I think the best word to use. So a dogmatic reliance on certain terms, on certain thoughts and reasonings. And he states that indeed we cannot know that causality is there, or at least in his arguments against these scientific thinkers, he argues that we cannot see that causality is there. But that doesn't mean that science cannot bring us anything. So he writes quite a expanded or quite a long part in this book, so the Incoherence of Philosophers, on how we get into um, or how we develop sort of our scientific thinking, which starts with our senses, and we um, take in different stimuli via our senses, and this is sort of our first connection to the outside world, which are our senses. And then over time we also develop our thoughts, and with our thoughts we develop scientific reasoning and rationality, for example. And let me first take a sip of my coffee. I have a very fancy mug. No, it isn't about the mug itself, it's about the content. Right, so what we see is that indeed over time we develop our rationality to comprehend the world. But then Al-Ghazali stops, and we should stop here too for a little bit, because at the start Al-Ghazali states that he is in a sort of ocean of troubles. He is surrounded by the ocean and needs to delve in to find out where truth lies, where reality, no, not reality, but where the truth lies, and he feels sort of overwhelmed by the uncertainty of the world and how big it is and how much he does not know. And he writes out his troubles in a sort of meditational way, just as Descartes did. So he writes out that he was doubting a lot, and that he doubted his senses and doubted his rationality, and even he refers to the dream argument, which Descartes does too. So, for example, my thoughts are there in my dreams, and I can see my dreams vividly. So, how can I differentiate between the real world and my dreams? And then at a certain point, Al-Ghazali stops, and he states that God gave him a sort of insight. He opened his chest for God's light and was sort of relieved from his troubles. And he does not clearly so he does not clarify this much more until the chapter after he writes out these developments of our thinking and scientific thinking. Because after this chapter, he starts a chapter on inspiration, or at least this translation translated it as inspiration. So he starts to write on a sort of intuition, we could call it. And here I come into a bit of a here I get into a bit of a vague chapter, which is also quite a sensitive chapter. At least the translators wrote that it was quite a sensitive chapter, because what happens in this chapter is he writes on sort of godly inspired intuition. So he states that next to rationality we have a sort of intuition which can give us a sort of immediate sense of knowledge, which also could be, for example, a sort of prophetic sense of knowledge. So we could gain some insights, some prophetical insights or philosophical insights suddenly, without following the direct route of rational knowledge. And this intuition, or this inspiration, it's directly there. And the translators also describe how, for example, a lot of the choices that we make in our day-to-day life are based on this certain intuition, our sort of sixth sense. And later on, the translators combine these different books, so the Incoherence of Philosophers, but also with some other works, and try to explain this. So because Al-Ghazali didn't really clarify why this doubt was taken away, They give an argumentation based on also his other works on why God sort of took his cares away, or took his doubts away. And what they state is that, one, there are certain truths, certain facts that are there. They are fundamental and we can rely on them. So if, for example, the explanation that is given is that over time, we'll see that if you investigate a certain science, so for example, you take, let's take mathematics. If you work it out, you keep looking on the reasoning behind certain argumentations, you come to a certain endpoint, and this endpoint cannot be explained any further, which is also seen in our own thoughts. So, for example, if I do research for sociology, I first look at, for example, some papers, which I take for granted, sort of the knowledge that is there. I take for granted that it is scientific thinking, that it is discussed in a scientific way, that it's peer reviewed, that that's high of quality. So I already take certain knowledge for granted. Those writers also took certain knowledge for granted, and they use certain scientific ways to develop this paper. And the more you look into a certain science, the more you eventually find a sort of core principles behind which nothing really can be found. So we just have to accept that there are certain facts which we cannot expand further on. And these are just given facts. And then the translators also write out a certain section on how then our knowledge must be seen. And they refer to a text also by Al-Ghazali, where he sort of uses the metaphor of a walnut. And the walnut has a green layer, it has a brown, harder layer, then it has the fruit at its core, and oil, which is in the fruit at its core. And Al-Ghazali states that the outermost core is, sort of knowledge that just surrounds us. It isn't really that special. But then we take the harder core, which is more useful, and it's the knowledge that we take for granted in our everyday life, but also within, for example, scientific thinking, which within certain branch of even of knowledge, or our everyday life. So, for example, you don't think about causality anymore. You just take it for granted, as the philosophers did. So this browner outer layer, which protects us, is are the facts that we take for granted within our reasoning. And then we have the fruit, so the walnut fruit, which is our rational calculations. And within this fruit, we find this sixth sense. So this is our inspiration, sort of. And this is what we talked about, the intuition. And there he sort of states that, okay, these concepts are linked together. So we have the brown core, or the brown outer layer, the harder layer, which is the taken for granted knowledge, which we need to progress further within our rational capacities, within our rational topics, and our scientific thinking. But then also we need this intuitive sense, this intuition and this creativity to help us within the world, and also to give us certain senses of knowledge which we cannot find by rationality alone. For example, certain scientific thoughts are found by this intuition, and the authors link to, for example, the apple falling down on Newton's head, which just linked or gave him the intuitive sense of, okay, this is what I was looking for. So the authors made the point via this metaphor that the knowledge that's taken for granted, the scientific core, and then also this intuitive sense are all linked together and are needed. And yes, maybe, for example, the intuitive sense is more important than rationality, but that does not mean that we do not need rationality or that we can just set aside rationality. No, Al-Ghazali is quite in favor of rationality, of scientific thinking, and he sees the importance of it. So in the end, I found it a quite interesting book, and I do need to state that I really used the explanatory notes and the introduction, because if I didn't have the introduction that could guide me to who Al-Ghazali was, why he was controversial, so that's what we talked about regarding the sort of the unscientific image that he has gained over time, but also the explanatory notes on the philosophy that I just read was really helpful, because what I said is he doesn't really make his points that clear, especially not in this text. So we get a critique on the philosophers, we get a critique on certain branches of knowledge, we get a expansive or expanded explanation on his life, the oceanic feeling that he felt overwhelmed, and why he decided to write this book, and also why he then eventually decided to teach again in Baghdad. And his whole reasoning, but we do not really get an explanation on, okay, why did God sort of take your doubts away? Why was it instant, in a sort of instant solved? Why? And maybe that's also just my personal bias, that I need this explanation, that I am not just sufficiently, or that I just need this explanation to really agree with a certain point, and do not accept only the answer of God. I need to know why, for example, God took these doubts away and how he did that, and find the reasoning behind it. And maybe that's also in a sense not what Al-Ghazali preached. I mean, if we look at the walnut metaphor again, maybe he got this intuitive sense and it was just okay. He found this intuitive sense which said to him that some things are just okay to not delve deeper into, and to be not aware of, sort of. I don't know, but I needed this explanation, just to have a more expanded view on what he meant, which I missed in his own text. But then again, the explanatory notes really helped, and I'm happy that I read it. Especially for Dutch viewers, look the book up, and if you cannot find, or if you don't read Dutch, look for some channels that expand on his philosophy. So, for example, I know that there's an English channel which I will link to in the bio, that also that I watched for this video, that tries to explain this concept of Al-Ghazali's philosophy more. And the translator, Gerco Tempelman, if I'm correct, made some Dutch explanatory videos that you can also watch, that delve deeper into Al-Ghazali's philosophy. But yes, I was quite happy to read it, because I have a more, or in my view, I have a more nuanced sense of his thoughts, of his philosophy. And also, this is for the first time that I read a Islamic philosopher, which I found quite interesting. And also, it's really readable. It's really doable to read through the book. And Maybe at some points my explanation wasn't really that clear, which I'm sorry for. But then again, the concept that he talks about are also sometimes quite vague. But the core of the book is, or at least in my interpretation, is that he had a lot of doubts. He doubted everything, just like Descartes. And then at a certain point, he got a God-given sense that it was okay, that he shouldn't doubt anymore. And I think, at least, that that's the later point of intuition, of inspiration, where he introduces this sixth sense of knowledge, sort of, which is on a higher level than rationality, but all these levels that he explained need each other. So you cannot state that one is more, or you can say that one is more important than the other, but we need all the different levels of knowledge. Yes. Oh, and that last part was really interesting. And I'm sorry if I'm rambling a little bit, but that last part, I linked it to so with a small group, I've been reading Heidegger's Being and Time. And Heidegger talks about a sort of call that you get from within. So this part we will stop about Ghazali for a little bit. We're done with the review. This is just for the interested people. So Heidegger, he writes a part on the sort of a call coming from the inside. It's a call of your own sort of being, or Dasein, and this call tries to signal to you that you are not living to your fullest potential, sort of. So it tries to, in Dutch they use the term Oerzijn, which is sort of core being, or yes, core being is probably the best word, but it tries to hint to this core being, and that you did not use your full potential, and it tries to signal to you. It doesn't say anything really, but it signals to you via a sort of intuition, which is this call, that you are not living your fullest potential, or that you are lacking, sort of. And these are really linked to the intuition that Al-Ghazali talks about. So it isn't really, it isn't that simple to explain, but it's there. And it is a sort of a sixth sense on which we base a lot of our thinking, a lot of our choices in life. And yes, that's what I found really interesting. So a small side note on Heidegger. Yes, I will put the links in the description. Feel free to reach out. Feel free to let me know if you read the books or this book. Feel free to let me know what you think about it, or what I should read next, or if you have any tips on further works of Al-Ghazali. I'm happy to hear it. And yes, thank you for watching. Bye bye.